Yeah. Are we in already?
Yes.
Yes, good. Well, then let me to start. Yes. Hello, first of all, I'm Kakha Gogolashvili, and we are broadcasting from the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies, Rondeli Foundation, which is based in Georgia, in Tbilisi. As you know, our guest is Nicu Popescu, who is a very well-known expert and is based in Paris. So he represents European Council on Foreign Relations. And Nicu Popescu, as you know, he maybe not all of you, but many of you would know he's Moldovan origin, and he used to be also 1 year ago. He used to be Minister of Foreign Affairs of Moldova, and he's a well-known researcher on area in this Eastern Europe, Europeanization, European integration. I knew him since more than 15 years, maybe more. He used to work also on peace building issues and conflicts. Whatever concerns our region is actually the areas of his expertise. And he's really very, of course, very well experienced in the issues related to Moldova, politics in Moldova. And we decided to invite him for this session in order to have his views regarding the developments in Moldova, first of all. And of course, about Eastern Partnership and the future of Eastern Partnership. I think developments in Moldova are quite related and quite linked to the developments in the whole Eastern Partnership. Also, Moldova's case influences, I guess, development and the future of Eastern Partnership as such, its success. A few years ago, maybe Moldova, maybe more than few, but there was time in the beginning of 2010s, I would say, when Moldova was really front runner among Eastern Partnership countries. So at least in terms of European integration related reforms, this is approximation to EU acquis, and many other things, human rights, for example, and many other things related to or showing or indicating success on European integration path. Also, Moldova was first among these maybe all Eastern partner countries receiving visa-free treatment from EU, and just later it was received by Ukraine and Georgia as well. Association agreement, probably the earliest negotiation Moldova started among all three countries, maybe together with Ukraine, but still Moldova was one of the first countries starting in this area, starting negotiations on association agreement. And all three countries now of the Eastern Partnership, who now are so-called associated countries, EU associated countries of Eastern Partnership, they signed this agreement on 2014. But unfortunately, we know that there were periods, really periods of volatility in Moldova as regards to governance, as regards setbacks, as regards to governance, as regards to other European values, I would say, like in the area of rule of law, for example, and also economic hardships and economic policy not very successful. Many other problems developed in last years. Despite of this, Moldova was always considered anyway one of the leaders of Eastern Partnership countries, and its European aspirations were anyway not put under doubt. So still there was no such confidence in Moldova's choice to join EU one day or to progress on European integration path, etc. And there was a period when exactly when Nicu Popescu was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Moldova in 2019, there was a small period of 6 months or a little bit more when the Sandu, Maya Sandu, who is now president of Moldova, new elected president of Moldova, became prime minister, and her government was really a reformist government. And among them, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nicu Popescu. But this time ended shortly, and then again was some period of, I would say, uncertainty in this regard. And now new hopes are inspired by election of Maya Sandu, who was elected with 57% of votes, if I'm correct, and she really defeated the ex-president Dodon, who was considered a Russian man, actually, because according to many experts, and I can quote some experts, including Stanislav Secrieru, who is also a well-known Moldovan expert working in Paris, also in Paris in the Institute of Security Studies. He said that Dodon actually traveled mainly to Russia more than 10 times, maybe even 14 times traveled to Russia during his term, and never traveled to, for example, to to Bucharest, which is the closest ally, natural ally of Moldova, and never traveled to Kiev. With Brussels, his relations was also very on a very, very low level. And now the situation can reverse. So let me to ask first Mr. Popescu, Nicu, to explain us what goes on in Moldova, and can we really hope that Moldova will again become strongly oriented on European integration and will fight all deficiencies, will fight all problems that are causing its transformation towards a real European state. So, and then we will turn to the other issues related to Eastern Partnership. Of course, let's first talk about Moldova. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Kakha. And I confess it's with some nostalgia in a positive sense that I received the invitation from you, and I remember those good old days when I would regularly come to GFSIS at the time, and we would be, I think you were on the last floor, and I would be normally meeting you and Archil and Alexander Rondeli, whom yes. You know, you're all great friends, and even on this list of participants of this seminar, I see great friends who I haven't seen for quite some time. And I would like to say hi, everyone, and I do miss you, especially in these times. And it's been a while that I haven't been to Georgia. Thank you for this opportunity. I will talk a bit about Moldova, but I will also try, you know, where this is relevant, not to forget that we are virtually in Georgia, and perhaps some comparisons will make it easier for you to understand what has been happening. Unfortunately, I mean, based from the questions, one of the questions you asked is whether now we'll face a period of more or less positive reformist dynamism in Moldova. Mm-hmm. And I have to confess that basically just looking at our region, we see very often a strong desire by the populations to see such a dynamic reform, a dynamic process of bringing countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia closer to European standards and to the Euro-Atlantic space. But it's almost never happening in one sustained batches of several years of reforms. Yeah. We see this in Ukraine, where, as you know, the situation is moving somewhere, but not, you know, not necessarily with a sustained reform pace. We see it also in Ukraine, in Georgia, with the protests, the post-parliamentary election context, which again is not necessarily sending the best signals either for domestic politics. Or in Moldova, also the situation in domestic politics remains very complex and complicated, and whereas there is a strong desire from the population to see the country run better, disoligarchized, as we call it in Moldova, where the population would like to see corruption defeated, but you have very strong vested interests. Also, Moldova is a semi-parliamentary republic. So in the case of Moldova, we actually, if I look back at the last 30 years, we never had a situation where for 4 or 5 years, Moldova would have been concentrated on implementing reforms, be it economic or political, or reforms in the security sector or anti-corruption. Usually the way it worked in Moldova is that you have a couple of good years and then you have 3-4 bad years where decision makers kind of are entering into a mutual blockage, and that's complicated. So if I look ahead, we have a situation where Maia Sandu, who has built her credibility and is trusted as someone who is not corrupt at all, whose popularity comes from her anti-corruption campaign, but also her anti-corruption drive that she implemented while she was Minister of Education several years ago. She definitely has a strong mandate to fight corruption, but she also finds herself at odds with the parliament today, which still has a majority which is hostile to the new president. And even today, we already have a crisis back in Chisinau. So if I look ahead, I think that definitely there's an impulse for reforms, but we will go through as a country through several months of hostile cohabitation between the parliament and the president. And then we will see how this ends. Probably there is a high chance there will be early elections, but if not, the ordinary elections are in 2.5 years. Nonetheless, as I said, even if you look in general at the Balkans and Central Europe, having strong pro-reform majorities in all branches of government is something that is very rare. So we will have to make do with an imperfect situation in Moldova, where in the next few years, there will be a window of opportunity to do some positive things for the country. Now, if you want a small comparison with Georgia, and despite all of this, I do believe that our countries, if you look at them daily and weekly, and if you make a kind of balance sheet every December for the last several years, and you look back at the year, probably many political events have not been very positive. But if I look at how Georgia developed, but also how Moldova developed in the last 10-15 years, I do believe both of our countries are now basically much better functioning states when it comes to either democracy, that's more the case in Moldova, or the functionality of state institutions and much lower corruption levels, and that's the case of Georgia. Of course, both our countries are much more tied to the European space and to the Euro-Atlantic space through diplomatic, through security, through trade links, through economic links. So despite the fact that we've been having very difficult periods in, well, almost 30 years now, but I still see both states actually making some progress. And even if I look ahead, I do think this progress will be painful, but nonetheless advancing.
Yeah, may I just say that you absolutely correctly said that trade between our countries and the EU is developing, and especially for Moldova. Moldova is very advanced in this regard. So almost 60% of trade, if I'm correct, is related to EU. So Moldova naturally is binding itself to EU market, and its functional integration goes on despite of the negativities which exist in the country and which inhibit the integration, further integration, and especially institutional integration with the EU. In this regard, may I ask you here quickly, what do you think would the Sandus coming to the power mean that Moldova's population is changing, is more oriented towards the European integration. This is one thing. And second thing, which is absolutely sure, which I'm absolutely sure of, that the big part of population of Moldova which emigrated abroad is now becoming much more active in Moldova's internal politics. So the statistics show that twice as more people now participated in this election, living abroad, living not in Moldova, but Moldova citizens. Then it happened during the parliamentary elections of which occurred 2 years ago, right? Would this mean that Moldova actually as a society is turning more confident in European integration, and maybe this is irreversible signs of irreversibility and the end of volatility in regards of the choice, European choice?
So again, generally in the last 15 years, more or less, I think if I compare Moldovan public opinion and elite opinion, when it comes to attitudes to Europe and to European integration and Euro-Atlantic integration, Georgia has definitely had a much more systematic and persistently high levels of support for European integration. Both the tensions in relations with Russia before 2008 and of course after the war, that has created a Georgian political space and public opinion that is significantly more favorable to Europe and the United States than you have in Moldova. In Moldova, these attitudes have been fluctuating. So you have, as a rule, most of the time, you have somewhat more people supporting European integration than integration with Russia. So normally you'd have this number at around between 40 and 50%. And you also have periods, and you have a kind of pretty big block of the population who would rather see and favor policies that would bring Moldova closer to the Eurasian Union and Russia. And that is a kind of pretty big block of also of population, you know, that can reach up to 40%. Now, in the last 10 years, a couple of times, support for integration with Russia overtook support for integration with Europe. So if this is a kind of zigzagging pattern. I cannot, I mean, if you ask me, do Moldovans support more integration with Europe? Now, I will say yes, more than 5 years ago, but I don't know what will happen in 5 years from now, because these support ratings go up and down. On this, Moldova is also like Ukraine. And actually what happened in Moldova and in Ukraine is that support for European integration tends to go up when these two countries are ruled by Russia-friendly leaders. Because people basically are disappointed with Russia-friendly leaders, so they support more European integration. When both Ukraine and Moldova are run by pro-European leaders, very often before, in the last 10, 15 years, support for European integration goes down. That happened under the Orange coalition in Ukraine after the Orange Revolution, and that also happened in Moldova under some pro-European governments. But I think that is one way of looking at a foreign policy alignment. And here Moldova definitely scored much, to my mind, less of a positive dynamic than Georgia. But where Moldova, I think, is favored is that Moldova is very much structurally tied to Europe on many other issues. One is, of course, trade. Another one is migration patterns. A lot of people, well, Moldovans have visa-free, but a lot of Moldovans have EU passports, so they much more freely come and go and work freely in the EU. And of course, you have trade. Moldova now has some 65% of Moldovan exports go to the European Union market, and only 9% go to Russia. So Moldova exports 6 times, 7 times more goods to Europe, to the EU, than it does to Russia. What does it mean? It means that it doesn't matter what political leaders think about foreign policy. They all have to be very careful about being accommodationist, if you want, to Europe. And this is what happened to Moldova's previous president, Dodon. While he was in opposition, he was campaigning and he was saying that he wants to bring Moldova closer to the Eurasian Union. He was someone who was against the association agreement with the European Union. At some point, he even said that Crimea is de facto Russian. But once he came to the presidency, he could not implement his basically foreign policy positioning. Why? Because in the case of Moldova, even if you are pro-Eurasian Union, you cannot do it. Because if you do it, that kills the economy, you lose jobs, and you have a revolution next day for very objective reasons. The other thing that happens is geography. Ukraine is between Moldova and Russia, and that has a big impact on trade flows, and not only trade flows, but capacity to project military power. So even though, you know, there is this public opinion level, but on structural level, Moldova has done quite well in being more and more almost irreversibly integrating with the European economy. And here is where, for example, Georgia, and I'm sorry to say this, is much less well positioned, partly because of geography. So Georgia has actually benefited much less from the association agreements opening and much less from the from greater access to the European Union market, since the association agreement was initialed in 2014.
Yeah.
So if you look at Moldova's exports, they went much more up to the European Union, and Georgia, I think, went about 30%, if I'm not mistaken. And
Georgia,
you're muted, Kakha.
With Georgia, it's around 25%.
Yeah.
Trade, EU trade with Georgia, yes.
Yes. So Georgia is much more exposed and dependent and linked to the Turkish market, but even to the Russian market.
Yeah.
So in this sense, you have a public opinion that is more pro-European and more pro-Euro-Atlantic. But when it comes to trade links, and trade links also create geopolitical dynamics on their own, Moldova is still in a regional context that makes Moldova feel more or less not entirely comfortable, but which allows Moldova a certain degree of room for maneuver. Because basically today Moldova's trade dependencies mean that no political leader can really seriously think of integrating with the Eurasian economic space. You're muted, Kakha.
Sorry, yeah, some technical problems. Yeah, that's of course very interesting observation. From one side, Georgia's population is much more demandant in terms of orientation towards Europe and more political aspirations about joining Europe than on average Moldovan population. From other side, Moldova is just condemned to be with Europe because of these economic links, and not only economic, to my view, this is also cultural links and exchange, not only with Romania, but in general with Eastern Europe, and with Moldova also participates in Balkan cooperation formats, and is trying also to establish itself as a Central European state, etc. So yes, I think that the slogan "the Moldova should be inside of the Eurasian Union" is absolutely meaningless and has no really any economic sense. Yeah, thank you. And here maybe I would also ask you about possibilities of the early relation, because it is really now it's of primary importance that this success, which was achieved with the election of pro-European president, can be really sustainable and stable, and can have real impact only in case if you have early elections, and if you achieve pro-European forces achieve to become ruling power in the parliament. So forming the government and developing a strong agenda, which is first of all directed to the elimination of corruption, to my view, transparency, and introducing actually really European governance. And then everything else comes easier, to my view. So what do you think? What are the possibilities for such development? So the new elections in, I don't know, in 6 months, 1 year, or any other closer term than 2.5 years?
There is a reasonable chance that there will be early elections in Moldova, but I think I was more optimistic 15 years ago about having, 5 or 7 years of quiet, dynamic reformism for our countries than I am now. I do think that we see it everywhere in Europe, is societies are tired and they give this kind of impulse for reformism, but very often you get a lot of political forces and stakeholders, be it in the public opinion, that come and disrupt that. Now, I think in Moldova, this is a kind of a tale of two dynamics. So basically, the Moldovan political system is very good at checks and balances, for better or worse. So what happened, for example, with Georgia when President Saakashvili came to power, would almost not be possible in the Moldovan political system, which is much more decentralized and where power is much more evenly spread between parliament, local authorities even. So Moldova, as I said, never actually had several years of sustained reforms, partly because of this very strongly ingrained system of checks and balances between presidency and parliament. And that had two effects. One was positive, and that was the fact that in Moldova, no one managed to consolidate an authoritarian system. Several leaders in Moldova tried to do that. Some of them were presidents, some of them were kind of behind the door operators of and supporters of political parties, but none of them managed to consolidate an authoritarian system. And the Moldovan political system and population is very good at striking back against authoritarian tendencies. But it also means that even reformist leaders in Moldova actually almost never had a kind of full-blown institutional capacity to implement reforms for several years. So in our case, what was good for democracy has also been limiting reforms. And in Georgia, you had several rounds of somewhat more centralized political rule. But you also had more situations where reforms were progressing. So I cannot say that, in this sense, one system is better or worse. If you ask me very much personally, I think this is the situation we have in Moldova. We have to accept it, and it's frustrating when you have so many veto interests not allowing for sustained reforms, but this is the situation, and it has also had good effects on political pluralism and democracy.
Well, thank you, Nicu. And may I exploit a little bit your wide knowledge about the region? Moldova is very important. To my view, it's very important for Eastern Partnership as such, for the success of Eastern Partnership. Because as you said, clearly explained, Moldova is bilaterally is closed and naturally is very well positioned in order to go quicker on European integration way. If all these negative sides or negative factors are somehow improved. Yes, but in general, EU works with the countries, especially with small countries, it views in a context of regional integration. We saw it on the Eastern and Central European enlargement, also in Western Balkans, that there is a regional approach, actually, and regional interest that the EU has towards it. So, of course, there is regional interest towards the Eastern Partnership region, if we can call it like that. So it's former Soviet Union space, or its European part, minus Russia, of course. But we see what happens in this region now. That EU in 2009, when it started this Eastern Partnership, it, of course, had many expectations regarding the improvement of this region, democratization, and there were also expectations that more or less this region will be upgrading itself homogeneously. So more or less on the same, with the same rate, the countries will develop. But we see that there is very big gap now. What happens? So this Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, despite of this many negativities, still go much quicker towards Europeanization, on the way of accepting democratic values, and the mentality of people is changing quicker towards the European. And other countries, unfortunately, are less, of course, less successful in this way. So maybe some of them had chances. For example, Armenia had more chances than other two, even Belarus and Azerbaijan, in terms of reforms, especially after Pashinyan came into the power. But we saw now with this Karabakh war, we have new realities that we don't know where we go. In Belarus, we see the very big problems with the democracy, and there is very risky situation now that we don't know where Belarus really goes, and what will be the Russia's action towards Belarus. And Azerbaijan also in new situation. We don't know exactly what will be relations between Azerbaijan and Russia, and what kind of policy will the country choose for the future. But still, actually, it was already Eurosceptical, quite Eurosceptical. I mean, the government of Azerbaijan. But now it may become even more Eurosceptical, I think. So please explain what will happen with this Eastern Partnership according to your views. Would there be any division between the different states? Will Eastern Partnership be divided itself on two formats, for example, or something else happens to it?
Listen, I do think it's all somewhat natural for the European Union to have these regional policies applied and regional frameworks. And that also happens to a lot of regions. I mean, there's the regional policy on Africa, there's the regional approach to the Balkans, there's of course the Eastern Partnership, and there's the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. And of course, there's a huge difference between Syria, which is at war, and Morocco, which is a very close partner of the European Union. And this regional framework accommodates these kind of things. In the Balkans, you also have a situation that is quite similar. In recent years, you know that Croatia has joined the European Union. I mean, Croatia was given an EU accession perspective at the same time as North Macedonia and Montenegro and Serbia. But in the meantime, Croatia managed to join the European Union. And countries like Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia are quite far from joining the European Union. So they all had the same policy framework called Stabilization and Association Process. They all had the same type of agreement called the Stabilization and Association Agreement, but one is in the EU and the others will maybe take another 10 years to join the EU. So in this sense, that's just to tell you that the Eastern Partnership is not special. It accommodates different countries, but I do believe that it's still flexible enough, and we've seen it, to have in the same formally political format Belarus and Georgia has managed to go very far with the association agreement, with the visa-free partnership, with a lot of security cooperation with member states on peacekeeping, on foreign policy cooperation with NATO, and Belarus having a completely frozen dialogue with the EU. And of course, I mean, it would be, of course, much better if the EU would be in a position to give an accession promise to a country like Georgia or Moldova, and I am for it. But since this is not happening, I don't see really the Eastern Partnership being the problem. Because states, when they have the right leadership and the right the political opinion, are still able to benefit quite a lot from the Eastern Partnership. And that is what happened, as I said, with the deep and comprehensive free trade, visa-free regime, and other things. That's in a nutshell where I see. Now, of course, you have another, let me open another can of difficult conversations. The other situation is the conflicts. And you mentioned Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, and this is something where the European Union has not managed to have a big impact on the course of these conflicts, neither in the case of Georgia, nor in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, I would not be too harsh if countries want to go to war over territory. I mean, there's not much an institution like the European Union can do to prevent that. And that has happened, you know, or countries or leaders and forces. That happened in Syria, that happened in Lebanon, in Libya, in Syria, not in Lebanon, hopefully. Now it happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. So yes, the EU was not very influential, but a lot of actors haven't been very influential either. It's also quite interesting what the EU has been doing in Georgia. But also because most of our listeners know more or less Georgia. What happened in Moldova is also quite interesting. Because of Moldova's geography, the Transnistrian region actually trades quite a lot with the EU. And Moldova allows Transnistrian companies to trade with the EU as Moldovan registered entities. So companies from Transnistria, they have access to the EU market under the deep and comprehensive free trade area regime, which is most goods are actually tax-free. There are some quotas on some products, but that's something else. So actually today, most of Transnistrian trade is with the European Union. Transnistria trades more with the European Union than with Russia as a result of geography and a free trade agreement between the EU and Moldova. But that meant that Moldova accepted to offer this to Transnistria. But it also means that Transnistria produces goods which are exportable to the EU. Despite that, I confess that the conflict is still unsolved. So in the case of Transnistria, you have a situation where the political priorities of the local leadership are directed towards the Eurasian space and they want to get closer to Russia, but their economy is as integrated into the European economy as that of Moldova. And this gives Europe much more leverage than the EU would have on Georgia's conflict zones. But even with that leverage, the situation still remains unsolved because it's difficult to solve these situations. And at some point, you know, there were explorations of whether there would be ways to open a little bit more opportunities for Abkhazia and South Ossetia from Georgian EU cooperation. That was 10 years ago. That didn't work very well, but that is, of course, we have to recognize that the geography of Georgia's conflict zones and Moldova's conflict zones are different and the economic structures are different. And there are some objective reasons as to why Europe is a stronger and more influential player in Moldova's conflict than it is in Georgia's conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. We also intended an association agreement between Georgia and the EU actually mentions that the benefits of this CFTA can be extended fully on conflict territories when these territories actually are subjected to Georgia's control, which doesn't mean exactly political control, but that could be a different type of control. For example, if Georgia can establish, for example, sanitary, phytosanitary institutions there, or as you said, in registration procedures, that's if Abkhazian, for example, firms will be registered and can be monitored from side of Georgia. So you should show the possibility of control. The problem in Georgia is that the dialogue between proper Georgia and Abkhazia and de facto the government has never reached such a level of understanding in order to talk about these technicalities. Actually, there was Georgian government tried to do this, saying frankly, several times even they presented, they sent the draft of vision how to involve Abkhazia in DCFTA preferences. But there was no any interest from side of Abkhazian rulers. Unfortunately, this is different type of problem, and the problem is that Abkhazia is practically integrating economically in the Russian sphere, and even they intend to integrate into the this Eurasian Economic Union. So it's absolutely different problem here. But still, I think that this is very interesting. Moldova's example is very interesting, and maybe in future there will be possibility to apply it to Georgia as well. So let me to ask you some little bit more about this regional issues. What do you think about Russia and its position towards Eastern Partnership, towards Europeanization? For example, in Moldova, it was actually practically Vladimir Sokol, for example, said that it was Soviet Union was defeated in Moldova with these presidential elections. Maybe too strong evaluation, but still, this means that Russian interests somehow, which is incarnation of Soviet interest to my view, they were damaged actually with these presidential elections in Moldova. But would Russia prepare any new actions in order to stop this possible advancement on integration with Europe of this region? Would it be Georgia, or would it be including Armenia or any other, or even outcome of the situation in Belarus, if it is in favor of, for example, of Europeanization of the country? What Russia will do, and what is the Russian vision to your opinion? How it wants to act to stop this kind of transformation of this region?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to read and speak on behalf of Russian strategic thinking, but as an observer from outside, I would like to point several things that I notice. I mean, one, it's still, if I compare our two countries, geography matters. When it comes to security and military capacities to project power, it is much more easy to do that against Georgian interests through, troops or other types of deployment through the conflict zones than it is in Moldova's case. That also has another factor that in the way I see Russian thinking about its own wider neighborhood is that, of course, countries like Belarus or Ukraine or Georgia are much more important in the ranking of Russian strategic priorities than a country like Moldova, which is further away. And that also means that, to my mind, Russia will, or at least for the foreseeable future, invest more effort, more attention into projecting its own power and limiting the potential, foreign policy options of a country like Georgia than like Moldova. Of course, Georgia compensates that through other things, through a higher degree of national consolidation behind Euro-Atlantic goals. But I think Georgia's neighborhood and the region is more volatile and more risky for Georgia. And we have just seen now with Nagorno-Karabakh, I think, a very kind of sharp change in the map of how security, regional security looks like. On Azerbaijan, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll manage to mention a couple of things of Azerbaijan, about Azerbaijan. Overall, so all of these factors geography, means different trade patterns, different capacity to project power. I do think that, basically, if I look at what Russia hoped it can achieve in the post-Soviet space 10 or 15 years ago and what it has now, I don't think Russia has a lot of reasons to be very happy. I think that, yes, Russia is much more visible, much more influential in sub-Saharan Africa and the Central African Republic, in the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya, in the oil dialogue with Saudi Arabia, in Venezuela.
In South Caucasus also just recently.
Yes, but if I look at Russia's, what it wanted from Ukraine, or what it wanted from Moldova 10, 15 years ago, I see that Russia's most objectives actually failed to be achieved. Both Ukraine and Moldova have managed to consolidate some degree and a greater degree of strategic autonomy. They're less dependent on the Russian market. They are more tied to the European and Euro-Atlantic space. That also applies to Georgia, but I still think Georgia is a bit more vulnerable because of its geography. So if I were a Russian kind of decision maker, I would not be very happy with how successful or unsuccessful Russia has been in achieving its goals in its own neighborhood. And I think we are still witnessing a continuous erosion of Russian power in its wider neighborhood, not everywhere, not in Azerbaijan. I think Russia is now much more influential in Azerbaijan than it was 2 months ago. Not everywhere in Central Asia, but Russian power continues to be eroded in Central Asia by China, and in Ukraine, Moldova somewhat. And I think it's also important to note that even in a country like Belarus, Russian long-term power is also eroded because of the alienation of Belarusian public opinion. This is not going to have very quick effects, but that's not something which is completely irrelevant. Now, if you want another kind of twist to the story of how Moldova has been trying to manage Russia, then Moldova actually adopted,
Just one remark. So I want to remind to participants that they can pose questions on Q&A under the Q&A section or saying the box. So if they wish. Yeah, please go on.
So the way Moldova handled Russia is very different from the way Georgia has handled Russia in the last almost 30 years. Basically, after the conflict in Transnistria ended in 92, from 94, Moldova decided to be a neutral country. So Moldova adopted neutrality. And Moldova's strategic thinking, if you want, at the time was that because Moldova adopts neutrality, this will give Moldova an excuse to ask for Russian troops withdrawal, for conflict settlement, but this will also make Russia less concerned and less antagonistic to Moldova. So Moldova never tried to, on the one hand, join NATO. On the other hand, it always had this shield whenever Russia tried to suggest, accession to the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So Moldova adopted this stance, which removed, military alliances as an irritating factor in relations with Russia. Georgia, on the other hand, I think went from one extreme to, it's not necessarily, extreme is not a good word, but as you remember, Georgia between 95 and 99, I think, was part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Georgia legalized at the time 4 Russian military bases. So it was Gudauta, Vazyani, there was an airport, right? And Batumi, right? Akhalkalaki and Batumi, right?
Yeah.
So, and Moldova never legalized any Russian military base. So Georgia tried to solve its security problems and conflicts first by allying with Russia, by building an alliance with Russia. But then it didn't work, didn't help Georgia. So Georgia went the other way and tried to join NATO. And that kind of relationship was at some point closer to Russia, and then it was much more distant from Russia. And that has created, some dangerous dynamics of its own. So the way Moldova is now trying to handle Russia is to say that listen, Moldova wants to come closer to the European Union. Moldova is integrated economically with the European market. But Moldova still wants a positive relationship with Russia. Positive meaning, let's respect each other. Russia should respect Moldovan neutrality, but Moldova will also not seek, to join NATO. That's a bit what Moldovan messaging of most of the political elite has been. And this sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, but generally also Moldovan political elite tends to be much softer in speaking about Russia than large parts of the Georgian political elite or Ukrainian political elite. So Moldova is trying to limit the potential fallout in its interactions with Russia, which doesn't always work, but nonetheless there is this kind of consensus which tries to limit tensions with Russia, while at the same time try to bring the country closer to Europe.
Yes, thank you very much. And there is also very well observed trend in the Western community. I would say in Europe and especially in Euro-Atlantic community, that Black Sea is becoming an important place for the security of this community. We saw just NATO ministerial was completed. There was a NATO ministerial 2 days ago, 1st, 2nd of December, and actually Secretary General of the NATO, he pointed out that Black Sea was a matter of discussion between the NATO allies ministers, and also new NATO concept will concentrate more profoundly on the Black Sea security issues. So, and NATO is trying to enhance operations, and so it's becoming important. I guess that Black Sea area is very much resembling Eastern Partnership area. Practically, it's matching, and the wider Black Sea area, saying, but EU does nothing despite of 2016 EU new security strategy, global strategy so-called, which was stressing necessity to help partners to increase their resilience, right? So it means that to help these partners to become more stronger in security, in providing their security, not just economic resilience and other type of resilience, but security as such. And now the NATO partners also, they stressed that they should contribute to the resilience of increasing resilience of NATO partners. Among them, of course, is Georgia, is considered as and Ukraine is considered as aspirant countries, and it's about, of course, about increasing their involvement and in NATO operations and in this area. So I want to ask you whether, do you think that EU and NATO in the future would join the forces or join the efforts in order to make more, to have better results for any kind of reforms in this area? So they should join, should or not, they join their efforts in order to provide more security in this region. And it's not about only NATO, but also about EU, who should deploy more security instruments and cooperate with NATO in this regard, involving Georgia, Ukraine, and maybe Moldova in some elements. Moldova is still a neutral country, but it depends what kind of elements we are talking about. For example, Moldova can fully participate in preventing the hybrid threats, for example, if not directly about talking about hard security. So please, could you comment on these issues?
So I thought that if we would have structured this as me having an introductory presentation, I wanted to actually start by doing something of a balance sheet of what the Eastern Partnership has managed to achieve and what it didn't achieve. And of course, as part of its exercise, one of the biggest insufficiencies of Eastern Partnership was this reluctance to deal with security issues. The EU tried to do a bit of conflict mediation, but generally the EU has avoided doing capacity building for the security apparatuses and security cooperation and military cooperation with countries like Georgia and Moldova. There are legitimate reasons for that. The EU is not a military institution. NATO did a lot. There are multiple reasons for that. But nonetheless, I think that almost 20 years since the European Neighborhood Policy was launched and started to be discussed from 2002, I think it's time for the European Union to start looking at security partnerships with countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And that this has been the biggest insufficiency of Eastern Partnership, partly because the security situation in this region deteriorated. And if you don't deal with that, you will not get very far in achieving other goals, democracy promotion, prosperity, unless you also start dealing with sensitive parts of security sector reform. I think here there are several, I almost have this symbolic image in mind of, at some point more than 15 years ago, the European Union financed the reconstruction of a railway station in Schim Valley. And of course, that building was destroyed during the war. And I was always telling the Europeans, listen, I mean, you can invest a lot. I think the other kind of visual image I had in my mind was I went to Shirokine a couple of years ago, and that's the last village on the front line near Mariupol in Donbass. And we went on a patrol with the Ukrainian army. And, just across 5 kilometers after Shirokine, you had these windmills, electricity generating windmills, which were on the separatist territory. And when we discussed, I asked what's that, and they said that, that was this, and when I read, that was an investment of $400 million in sustainable energy in Ukraine. And that was the biggest wind farm in Ukraine. And there was EBRD funding, international funding. But the bottom line of it is that, yes, you can build railway stations in Schim Valley, you can build windmills, but if you don't help stability and security, you lose these investments. And that's kind of, it's a bit symbolic, but that's why I've been in recent months, especially having a lot of conversations throughout the EU on the need of developing a security dimension of Eastern Partnership. And now, if you allow me this possibility for 2 minutes of publicity time, but we launched an initiative called the Eastern Partnership Security Compact through a series of papers and articles, where we basically make some 30 policy recommendations as to how the European Union can develop security cooperation with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. We've done this together with, we did it as a joint initiative with 2 former foreign ministers from Georgia and Ukraine, with Pavlo Klimkin and Ekat Gogolashvili. And we just published recently a follow-up paper. And what we've been trying to do is to make sure that the next round of Eastern Partnership deliverables include more policies designed to help the security of Eastern partners. And as we speak, there was recently a non-paper from several EU member states which are advocating new policies along these lines. So there is a strong discussion in Europe about having more security cooperation with the neighbors.
Very good. Nicu, I know you needed some small break to make.
No, it's okay. This has been solved, and I can stay a bit longer.
Very good.
And Gia, I think, had a question.
We will not keep you long here, of course, but still, there are 2 questions. If you see questions and answers in this box, and it would be very good if you could respond to Gia's question. And there is also an anonymous attendee who Gia asks about Maria Sandu's declaration regarding withdrawal of Russian troops, and there is also any one more question regarding the, opinion about what is the main problem that delays Moldova's integration in EU. So, please, floor is yours.
Yes. So, thank you very much, and it's good to hear from you, Gia. Listen, on this, there was a big media wave in recent days about Maia Sandu saying that Russia should withdraw troops from Moldova. And this media wave is somewhat surprising because actually all Moldovan leaders always said that, including previous President Dodon said that Russia should withdraw troops, and Maia Sandu did that. And as I said, Moldova never signed, at no point, no Moldovan government, no Moldovan president signed or agreed to any paper that says that Russia can have a military base in Moldova. Peacekeepers is different, but military base, no. So Maia Sandu just reiterated what all Moldovan governments said. It's also true that she called on the replacement of peacekeepers with the civilian peacekeeping mission. So she kind of said these two things together, which I think is what partly, but again, this civilian peacekeeping mission, peace support mission has been a standard Moldovan demand since 2003. But this was a media storm. I mean, it's something you always say in Moldova if you're asked. She said it, all Moldovan leaders said it, but for some reason now this generated a media storm, partly because, in the Russian media, of course, there was all this concern that there is this new leader who wants to bring Moldova closer to the EU. Does this mean, Russia is losing, or what is the situation? So it's just that this changing government in Moldova is perceived in Russia with some nervosity. And I think this is partly why there was this nervous reaction. But just to tell Gia, I mean, it's a standard position. It's not something which will lead now to a new initiative. And generally, the message that Maia Sandu has had in less publicized, but in the same speeches and interviews, is to say that she wants to bring Moldova closer to Europe, but she wants to maintain a decent and positive relationship with Russia, if that's possible, and that she will try and will treat, Russia with respect and pragmatism, and will be respectful of Russia as much as she can. But of course, it depends on both Russia and Moldova if a positive relationship can be maintained. So she has been saying that quite systematically. It's just that this is a less headline grabbing type of statement. So we'll see. I think the emotions of the first weeks will pass, and we will see how dialogue with Russia will evolve. And even from my own personal perspective, in September last year, I went to have a bilateral visit to Moscow, and we had a joint press conference with Sergei Lavrov. And I said in that press conference that Moldova would appreciate if Russia withdraws the troops from Moldovan territory, and that wasn't a controversy. I mean, it's not possible for a Moldovan politician in Moscow or in Brussels or in Berlin or in Chisinau not to mention this. And we do this kind of calmly without, offending Russia. But it is always said. And last year it was not a media problem, but now the political context is a bit different. And also a lot of the Russian media kind of jumped on this. But yes. And there was another question on why Moldova is still not in the EU. Well,
what are the
main
causes to inhibiting or stopping or creating barriers for Moldova's further integration?
I think there are two major things. One is Moldova's very unimpressive reform performance. Corruption in Moldova is huge. It's much higher than in Georgia. I mean, I think Transparency International puts Moldova on the 120th place. Georgia must be what, the 50th more or less, I think. Even Armenia on these indexes is better than Moldova. On cost of doing business, Moldova is much worse than Georgia and Armenia, for example. So Moldova has not been having, Moldova has good geography, but not a good, reform performance as a state in the last 20 years. That's one thing that constrained. So Moldova had a lot of opportunities in relations with the EU, but it managed to benefit from some, but not all of them. The second thing is, of course, the fact that the European Union is not ready now to open the doors. So Moldova, the EU promised accession to the Balkan countries, but even that is not very easy. So we see that North Macedonia, and Albania, and Serbia, and Montenegro are still quite far from acceding to the EU, and Moldova is even more removed from that. So I think there is reluctance for now in the EU, and there is this problem with state capture and corruption in Moldova, and that is why actually Maia Sandu got such a strong mandate, because there is a strong demand to fight corruption in Moldova.
Yeah, thank you very much. You have some few minutes that we continue. Okay, thank you very much, because it's everything very interesting what you talk about. So this using this opportunity is important for us. I would like to ask you now about the prospects of cooperation between Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia as most strongest pro-European countries in this area. I understand your point saying that there will be no reform of Eastern Partnership, there will be no separate format for these three countries, etc., which may be very realistic, what you said, and could we agree about that? But what about the countries themselves? Is there any necessity that Moldovans feel in increasing cooperation with pro-European countries in this area, so in particular with Georgia and with Ukraine, so to deepen cooperation? For example, all of them have this DCFTA with Europe. Well, they have free trade agreements between themselves. Okay, it's a Soviet-based, it's a post-Soviet free trade agreements since 1994, 1995. But another thing is to create a deep free trade area between these three countries and increase integration, economic integration of these three countries. Now, or cooperation in other issues related to the European integration. So to help each other with in this reform agenda. Do you think that with the future government, if government will be changed in Moldova and it's actually is more or less government created by the country PAS party, saying the Sandu's party actually, and in coalition with other pro-European forces, which are 2 or 3 in Moldova's parliament, this government will be interested in creating more economic and political cooperation in the region with these pro-European countries. And what are the reasons for such cooperation? What are the arguments?
I think there is a lot of openness in this format, but this openness has been there for more than 20 years. And we all remember Guam, and there is BSEC, and you know, now we are free associated countries, but somehow it never really drove a lot of kind of dynamic cooperation. I don't know why. I think part of it is geography. If we look at the 3 countries in question, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, then I think what we see is a lot of strong bilateral cooperation links between Moldova and Ukraine on economic issues, on social, on tourism, on culture, on a lot of things, on trade.
But less with Georgia.
Less with Georgia.
Yeah.
And there is also, there used to be strong Ukraine-Georgia political links and pretty good economic links. Not least, you know, Odessa, Batumi, some transit, general trade, flights. But now, of course, what hampers this trilateral cooperation is the fact that relations between Kiev and Tbilisi are not the greatest. This is visible, and that is limiting opportunities. Between now, what you have, I think, on free, where the 3 countries have theoretically a very good platform to coordinate together. And this is what brought Guam together in the late 90s, Guam started as coordination between our countries when it came to coordinating positions in the OSCE on Russian troops, on conflicts, on disarmament, on conventional forces in Europe, adopted treaties. So there was always this Georgian Moldovan solidarity on conflicts, on Russian troops withdrawal in the OSCE. But in the last more than 10 years, I think Georgia just went ahead to intensify security links with its NATO aspiration prospects, with much more increased bilateral cooperation with the United States on anti-terrorism, on security, on Iraq, on Afghanistan. So just where Georgia just accelerated and went so much further than Ukraine and Moldova in developing security links with the US and NATO, that is not necessarily always, it's good to coordinate positions, but Georgia has much richer and thick and intense security links with other countries and is investing a lot. Moldova stayed with its neutrality, not very involved in security conversations. Ukraine also went through this kind of ping pong. First, you had President Yushchenko trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. Then you had President Yanukovych trying to turn Ukraine into a non-aligned country. Then you had the war. So all of these things just distracted attention on this security cooperation dossier that was important in the 90s and 2000, but is less important for Tbilisi, Kiev. So there are all of these factors which I see that they limit a little bit the potential interaction. Having said that, on a working level, the relationship is very good. The countries regularly adopt joint positions in the Eastern Partnership. A year ago, the three countries just did a non-paper with the same suggestions on the future of the Eastern Partnership. Now, with this push for security cooperation with the EU, all of them are in agreement. So, on lots of specifics, they agree on what to expect from the EU, but there is still some ambiguities, and you know them, between Kiev and Tbilisi, and Chisinau and Tbilisi are too far, and there is not enough, there's not direct flights, not enough of exchanges, not enough tourism, not enough trade. So all of that, I think, also means that relations with other players and countries are actually more intense.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting, your analysis regarding this prospect. I think we can talk further and further, and so many things could be discussed. But for this first meeting that we organized on this subject, I think it was quite informative and enough, and I appreciate very much your time and your expertise and your opinion. Let me to conclude our meeting here, as we promised to have 1 hour meeting, and it's 1 hour 15 minutes already. So, but still very informative. To my view, it was really excellent discourse from your side. So thank you very much, Nicu. I wish you all the best. I don't know whether you will be going back to Moldova's government or as a politician involved in Moldova's next parliamentary elections or something else. But still working at your place, you do a lot for your country. Again, in emploi of expert or if you be a politician or a government representative, everywhere you will do positive work and the necessary work for your country, and not only for your country but for the region and for. So I wish you all the best. Thank you very much once again. And
thank you very much. Didi Madloba, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope we'll have to do this opportunity in person in Tbilisi. And I've actually done a couple of lectures at GFSIS ages ago in person, and I hope I will be back and I will see all my great friends, and some of them are on this attendees list, and we'll see each other in person sooner rather than later. And thank you very much for this opportunity. And good luck, and we'll stay in touch and we'll continue our conversation in the future.
Thank you very much. And I would like also to thank very much the loyal participants who were listening the conversation, and some of them participating with questions. Thank you, all of you, and all the best. Good luck, health first of all at these difficult times, and everything else. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.